children. And when my children were small, one of their favorite outings was going to the frog pond. Now, you shouldn't bother to conjure an image of a pristine body of water surrounded by verdant meadows, maybe a cow or two mooing nearby. There are places like that in Maine, plenty of them, but for reasons I can't recall any longer, our family got in the habit of visiting what had amounted to a glorified puddle alongside Route 90. By Maine standards, Route 90 is a big and busy road, a handy time-saving hypotenuse between Route 1 in Waldoboro and Route 1 in Rockport. Along it are the sort of enterprises that need cheap space and good road access more than curb appeal. So there's a light manufacturing place, an antique mart, a lighting store, a Subaru dealership. The little pond was scraped out sometime during construction to provide an emergency source of water in case one of the businesses caught fire. But nature abhors a vacuum, so disregarding the traffic zipping by, the pioneer alders and the white pines took root in the disturbed earth beside the pond alongside cattails and lilies. And soon enough, the water weed and the butterflies and little fish, dragonflies and water sliders, water boatmen, and a couple of local frog species enthusiastically colonized, making of this scrape a handy bit of heaven for my 4 small child naturalists who were interested in mud and water, and depending on age and personality, learning to distinguish frog's eggs from toad spawn, Lepidoptera from Odonata. Well, my daughter Ellie was the frog whisperer. While her brothers armed themselves with nets and stalked among the cattails, while her baby sister crawled around eating mud, Ellie would settle herself on the bank of the little pond and meditate. And sometimes her deep thoughts would be accompanied by her gentle muttering. Perhaps she'd sing a little song. Distracted by her more demanding siblings, my baby Wooly would need to have some particularly indigestible lump of something removed from her mouth, or Peter and Zach would contest custody of the fishnet. I would leave Ellie to her own devices for a quarter hour or so at a time. And when my attention returned, I would find my 3rd child still sitting in the same place, and the water around and in front of her would be studded with the triangular faces of perhaps a dozen frogs of various sizes, all floating in a semicircle and gazing raptly at her with their gold-rimmed eyes. Sometimes one would even have ventured up onto the bank, close enough to place a small green hand onto the toe of her red sneaker. The boys caught frogs, learning to hold them tenderly in their wet hands so they could look for the distinctive mottling of the leopard frog and the bright green lips and the pale throat of the green frog, or the robber mask worn by the wood frog. And they would marvel at the delicate skin and the propulsive power of those muscular back legs. Occasionally, on our expeditions, we discovered evidence of the harshness of nature, say a dead baby bird dropped by a wasteful, marauding crow, or evidence of human mindlessness. Once we found a jam jar filled with tadpoles standing at the bank. Some rotten kid must have caught them, and rather than just admire the shiny licorice bodies, their translucent tails, their sprouting limbs, just looking at them for a few minutes and then pouring them out. This kid had walked away, leaving them imprisoned, and they died. So there were many angry tears in our party that day, which had to be soothed by an impromptu Unitarian Universalist memorial service and the writing of an indignant letter to the editor re the respect owed to the creatures with whom we share planet Earth. But then there was the day a grievously injured adult frog turned up in the fishnet. He was a really big, fine bullfrog. But the boys' squeals of admiration turned to horror when they saw that his right hind leg was missing. Below what would in a human being have been called a knee, only bone remained exposed. "He's hurt," Peter said. "Do something," said Zach. Holding the rim of the net just clear of the water so the maimed frog couldn't escape, I considered my options. I will admit, a bit of a messiah complex. And my children were still young enough to think that Mom was powerful enough to fix anything. So, should we take him to the vet? What could the vet do other than put the frog to sleep? And I cringed at the idea of a frog getting stuck with a needle, because that seemed like it would hurt. And besides, I doubted the poor thing would even survive the stresses of the drive to the clinic, stuck in a hot car with 4 damp, muddy, deeply interested fellow passengers. And frogs bring out the maternal in me with their vulnerability and their harmlessness, their benevolent expressions and nearly human hands. I wanted so badly to help this one, phlegmatically treading water in the circle defined by our net. I think taking him in the car to the vet would just make his suffering worse, I explained. "He's suffering?" Zach said. "Do something." Well, I guess I could put it out of its misery. I grew up on a farm, so I looked around for a rock or something. But the idea of smashing a frog to death with a rock didn't seem like much of an improvement over the hot car and the vet's needle. So finally, feeling inadequate and cowardly, I said, no, we'll just have to let him go and let nature take its course. So deciding it was the least we could do, we christened the frog unimaginatively Froggy. Then I pushed the net down into the water until he could float free, and he lay in the water for a moment, gulping and gazing adoringly at Ellie. And then with surprising alacrity for a dying anuran, Froggy vanished into the cool and weedy depths. And we talked about Froggy all the way home. At least 2 of us had bad dreams that night, involving leg bones and sobbing veterinarians in lab coats, throwing rocks at muddy babies. At breakfast, we said a small prayer for Froggy, sure that by then his little froggy soul had swum to heaven. And a year went by, fall, winter, spring, summer, and one early autumn day, the kids and I were out and about for the first time in a while, and we decided to stop by the frog pond again. Everyone was a little bigger. Wooly was old enough not to eat mud anymore. And the children's father, a state trooper, had been killed in a car accident while on duty in the spring. But otherwise, the scene at the frog pond was reassuringly or surreally the same as it had been a year before. And Peter dipped his net into the water and pulled out a bullfrog with a missing leg. "Froggy!" he shouted. And I came along the pond edge to where my son stood, his little rubber-shod feet planted among the cattails, his net upraised, and I could see the contents attempting energetically to get out. Well, I couldn't change reality, but at least I could declare it. Oh, Peter, it couldn't possibly be Froggy. But it was. Unmistakably. Same markings, same fleshless leg bone sticking out below the right knee. But this time, instead of leaving the creature in the net, I took him out, wincing as that bone caught itself briefly in the mesh. He was a big, fat American bullfrog, heavy, easily as wide and long as my hand. And the bone protruded not from a fresh injury, but from what was clearly a long and well-healed stump. For all I knew, Froggy had been peg-legging it around that pond for years. And certainly he proved capable, despite his disability. With a slippery wriggle and a thrust of bone, Froggy propelled himself out of my hands and landed with a triumphant plop in the water. and with a coordinated stroke of webbed foot and femur, he was gone. Well, we caught Froggy a few more times over the years, and we like to imagine he got used to us and maybe even reciprocated our affection. Ellie was sure he was one of the regulars who showed up in the crowd of frogs that turned up to bask in her peaceful presence. But eventually the kids grew beyond the thrills of exploring what still amounted to a large-ish puddle by a busy road. And bullfrogs are said to live for 7 or 8 years at the longest, so by now even the indomitable Froggy has gone the way of all flesh. Though every time I drive past that pond, it's still there near the Subaru dealership and the lighting store, I think of him. His was a humbling lesson for me, one of many in the very fat file labeled, "Gee, I thought I knew more than I actually do." The first time I met Froggy, I assumed the kindest and the bravest thing I could have done would be to kill him, so as to spare him the lingering and painful death nature surely had in store. As I picked up the rock and weeping and apologizing brought it down upon his soft body, I probably would have felt not just justified, but absolutely sure I'd chosen the only and noblest possible way, murdering this creature out of what would have been, and blessedly turned out to be, a good and astonishingly long life. What counts as a good life? What makes life worth living, and what makes it not worth living? These are questions that get asked when, for example, you're terminally ill. My mom was asked that question when she was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. My mother replied that she considered life worth living as long as she could use her hands to draw and paint, generally make art, pat her dogs. This made more sense to me, her designated medical proxy, than it might otherwise have done, because back when I was about 10 years old, I asked Mom where she thought her soul resided, and she said hers was in her hands. Now, I had already located my soul at that point in what I would later discover was my prefrontal cortex. The neurologic seat of creativity and analysis, not to mention the site of mythology's heterotropic eye. Smack in the middle of my rather large rectangular forehead, I assumed everyone's soul must be in the same location. No, my soul is in my hands, Mom said, and she pressed one index finger into the palm of the other hand, not so much pointing out the spot as massaging it. Well, the Eastern symbol, the Hamsa, shows a heterotropic eye in the palm of a hand, so maybe the human body provides the soul with more choices in real estate than I imagined. But still, even then I thought, though I didn't say, what happens if you lose your hands? After all, if I lost my prefrontal cortex, my soul was probably en route to the afterlife anyhow, but my mother had small, soft hands that seemed suddenly terribly vulnerable, extending out into the hazardous world at the end of her pale arms. You can survive the loss of your hands unless your soul is in them. Cat Stevens, as he was then, came out with an album around that time, and my sister used to play it over and over on the record player in the playroom, and we would sing along to Moon Shadow. Remember that? I'm being followed by a moon shadow, moon shadow, moon shadow. And if I ever lose my hands, lose my power, lose my lands, if I ever lose my hands away, I won't have to work no more. Well, 40 years later, my brave little mother informed her palliative care doctor, as soon as I can't use my hands, I'm done. Asked what she meant by done, Mom declared that she would stop eating and die. Okay, the doctor replied, when the time comes, let me know, and we'll arrange for hospice care. And then the doctor looked at me for confirmation, the medical proxy, and the opening guitar lick for Moon Shadow began to play in my heart. And I said, okay, Mom, whatever you want. The bullfrog, if asked as a froglet whether he could imagine surviving the loss of his leg, would probably say no. Perhaps when it happened, the poor one-legged thing prayed for mercy. Wouldn't God, in the form of a heron or a snapping turtle, come along to relieve Froggy of what surely was a pain-filled, foreshortened future? As a young woman married to a man in a hazardous profession, I had reason to ask myself whether I could imagine life without Drew. And the answer was emphatically no. And when he was killed, the pain was everything I'd feared it would be and more. Self-euthanasia seemed a desirable blessing, only the needs of my 4 grieving children rendered truly unthinkable. It is normal and it's even necessary for us to say, this is who I am, and therefore this is what I need in order to be happy and whole. We say things like, I couldn't stand to be in a wheelchair. Or, if my husband died, I wouldn't be able to go on. We might say, I'm not the sort of person who can handle having a disabled child. Or, I can't imagine not being able to speak my mind. In a Newsweek article recently, a reporter described a conversation with a 65-year-old Dutch woman who was very sure she didn't want to get too old. Jannie Williamson is in near perfect health, the reporter writes, but as we sat down in a small cafe, she showed me papers that laid out the circumstances under which she no longer wishes to live. If she's severely and permanently lame, if she can no longer leave the house on her own, if she's dependent on others to eat, drink, shower, or put on her clothes, if she goes blind or deaf or is suffering from dementia. I'm an autonomous person, Williamson says. For me, it seems a disaster not to be able to go out and visit friends, go to the concert, go to the theater. And maybe that Dutch woman is right. Maybe she really couldn't stand life as a lame, blind, or otherwise dependent person. Maybe it really would be a disaster for her to not be able to go out and visit her friends or go to a concert or go to the theater. Sometimes a person really can't go on after the death of a spouse. Sometimes really can't stand being incapacitated. Sometimes the people who predict they'll be unable to handle the parenting of a disabled child are right, and they can't handle it. It's not like you can become a whole different person just because life is making a whole new set of demands on you, right? Especially if you're old, like my mom. My mother has been who she is for almost 8 decades. As an artist, the idea of living without her hands was as unimaginable as living without her soul. Like Nicodemus in the Gospels, she might have asked, how can someone be reborn when they're old? It's impossible, isn't it? It's impossible to grow and adapt, to become who we need to be in order to do the thing we thought we couldn't do. Well, Mom has now lost the use of her hands. It's getting hard, impossible really, for her to hold a fork, let alone a paintbrush. She's given up drawing and painting, but she hasn't stopped eating. Hospice has not been called. She hasn't chickened out. Mom is as fearless and stubborn, not to say pig-headed, as she ever was. But she has changed. She's become much more interested in and invested in her relationships with other people than she used to be. She's looking forward to her grandson's wedding, to the great grandbaby that's on the way. She's taken trips to visit old friends she hasn't seen in decades. She's welcomed them to visit her. And my mother just got back from a Mexican vacation, which doesn't sound that dramatic, but believe me, my mother is not the vacation in Mexico type. Or at least she didn't used to be. But now my mother has been born again. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. The illness that will eventually kill my mother, in the meantime, is being allowed to teach her. To teach my mother new ways to love and live, new ways to be joyful and creative, new ways to be a child of God, new ways to be herself. Blessed be. Amen.
You're visiting with us online today. We love connecting with people all across the country and around the world, sharing our powerful message of love beyond belief.
There's something new happening here. You can now join All Souls as a virtual member. Our virtual membership is designed for friends who live outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and who want to engage with All Souls in a meaningful way.
You can be part of an expanding family, a global family really, wherever you are. If you live in Oklahoma,
Ohio,
or Orange County, California,
Canada,
or Cameroon. By becoming a virtual member, you'll be able to deepen your connections with members and friends here in Tulsa and with members wherever you are.
Each week, you'll receive special All Souls content tailored for you, our virtual members. Virtual members have access to pastoral care, to personal prayers, and also receive invitations to exclusive web events.
You can learn more, and if you're ready, you can become a virtual member today by visiting allsoulschurch.org/virtual membership.
We're grateful our ministries are having a positive impact on your life, and we want to share the good news of love beyond belief with more and more people. So no matter what, we need your support to keep this ministry growing and thriving, so please consider making a gift today. You can do so by texting
LOVEBB for Love Beyond Belief to 73256, or simply visit our website. You are a blessing in our lives. May you be blessed.
And be a blessing.